This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 445 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thank you all for tuning in. The matchup show advice turned around in Week 9. I was right to be high on Kirk Cousins, Drew Brees, and Drew Lock, and Ryan Tannehill, who I didn't like, had his second worst performance of the season. I was wrong to think the Chiefs would get things going with their running backs, but I was right to be into J.D. McKissic's receiving upside last week. Jerry Jeudy had a big day, that was good to see, and Darius Slayton didn't do a whole lot, which I talked about. The biggest miss was easily Christian Kirk. I was afraid of his big play ability against a defense that had been decent against big plays. But that was totally and completely wrong. It was a pretty good week overall, though. Before getting to players that I like more and less than the consensus this week, I want to send one more reminder about the FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League for the Masters. It's a rake-free contest, and it's a $5 entry with a $1,000 prize pool. To enter, visit FanDuel.com/league/PGA Listener League. Eligibility restrictions apply. Let's kick things off this week with Jared Goff. It's really hard to not love his spot in Week 10. He's facing a Seahawks team that ranks worst in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They've allowed 7.1 more points to be scored on them per game to opposing passers versus those quarterback season-long averages. Part of the reason for that, though, is that they don't generate a whole lot of pressure. They've been below average in pressure rate, and that matches up well against a Rams team that's been one of the best at stopping pressure. According to Established Run's Pat Thorman, who's at Pat_Thorman on Twitter, great guy, he tweeted and showed that no team has been involved in more higher scoring games this year than the Seahawks. Seattle games have averaged almost 65 points per game. The team in second, Green Bay, is at 57 points. This game against the Rams is a nice 55.5 point over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook. We should expect scoring. And if there's going to be scoring, Jared Goff is going to be part of that. Now, earlier in the week, I mentioned Baker Mayfield as a top streamer this week. I still think he's a good option, but I've cooled on the matchup just a little bit. He's still fine, I just think that others are in that same tier. One of those others being Derek Carr. The Raiders get the Broncos this week, and Vegas has the fourth highest implied team total on the slate. Denver's been the seventh most advantageous matchup this year in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position as well. So I think that Carr works this week. And then in that same game, you could go to Drew Lock too. He's riskier than Carr or even Mayfield as a streamer, but Vegas is completely average as a matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And like I mentioned on the 10 Trends episode yesterday, Drew Lock is throwing it deep at a really, really high rate. And Vegas ranks in the top 10 in big play passes allowed. So we could see a scenario where his high variance style pays off, sort of like we saw last week. But I'd be playing Mayfield and Carr over Drew Lock. And I think Tua is a little bit more intriguing too. Now, on the flip side, I'm not very into Teddy Bridgewater. I talked about this with Drew Brees a little bit last week, but Tampa Bay has been a tougher matchup for teams because they can pressure opposing quarterbacks. That's going to help their secondary. It's similar to what Pittsburgh's been able to do at a high level too. That's why Brees was undervalued, because the Saints could handle that. I'm not sure the Panthers can. They've been below average in pressure rate allowed this year, and even though Teddy threw for over 360 yards the last time this team faced Tampa Bay, he was still sacked 5 times, and he still posted fewer than 9 fantasy points. I just think that there are better options this week. And for similar reasons, I don't really love Joe Burrow. The Bengals haven't been good at protecting Burrow this year, and Pittsburgh has had by far the highest pressure rate in football. I just see plays like this as super high variance. And when the ceiling probably isn't that high, it's just not worth the risk. So we know Zach Moss is the goal line guy for Buffalo, Josh Allen aside. But I think what's not being talked about enough is the fact that he's basically been seeing the same amount of work through the air as Devin Singletary has. He's not just some early down player who sees goal line work, and then Singletary just gets all the receiving work. That's not how it's working. Over the last 3 weeks, Singletary has just 3 more targets than Zach Moss, or 1 target per game. Meanwhile, this past week, we saw Moss get 82% of the team's running back rushes. And that's a number that I've talked about on this show. It's been gradually rising week over week. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I just think that the gap between Moss and Singletary needs to be wider. And I like Moss this week against the Cardinals. It's a game with a high over-under, and Arizona's been the 11th best matchup for opposing running backs this year in adjusted points allowed. So I think Moss is a viable RB2 play given the state of the position. And then similar to that is the situation in the Tampa Bay backfield. I talked about this at length on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week, so I won't bring all of that back up, but Ronald Jones is way below Leonard Fournette in rankings this week. I think that gap should be smaller. Carolina's been a team that you can run on this year, ranking 6th worst in adjusted points allowed to running backs. And the Bucs are 4.5-point favorites, so we should see a neutral to positive script for this Tampa Bay offense. That means Rojo could see more work as long as he doesn't fumble the ball away. So you can play him, in my opinion, if you need an RB2 this week with all the issues at running back. We've got a Kalen Ballage revenge game, folks. As long as the injuries align for the Chargers and Ballage this week, I think he's in play as a flex. He looked pretty good last week, and he had a 62.5% running back rush share to go along with a 7.3% target share. Miami's an average matchup, but it's tough to find potential volume ranked as low as Ballage is ranked this week. My deep play dart throw of the week is Chris Thompson. One thing that I don't think has been talked about enough this week is that Thompson returned to action last week, and in that game against Houston, he saw 10.5% of Jacksonville's targets. He had 4 of the 6 backfield targets for Jacksonville. I'd expect the Jags to take a run-heavy approach against Green Bay for a lot of reasons this week. So James Robinson is absolutely a good play. I'm just prepared for Green Bay to go up, which could lead to Chris Thompson being on the field more than James Robinson. The Packers are 12.5-point favorites. This is a complete dart throw play, though. I hope none of you would have to use Chris Thompson. But he's sort of interesting after seeing how the receiving work was divvied up last week in that Jacksonville backfield. Now, I didn't see a lot that I disagreed with on the negative side of things in rankings this week. And I don't want to sit here and say, don't start this player if I don't really believe in it. So let's just move on to wide receivers where things are pretty interesting this week. Now, I know I said bad things about Joe Burrow earlier, and I do think that he's a risky play. But Tyler Boyd in that matchup against the Steelers, he's not. Boyd's been great this year out of the slot. Only CeeDee Lamb has more slot targets than Tyler Boyd, according to Pro Football Focus. Well, the Steelers this season have continued to play poorly against that area of the field. That's been the case for years. But only Cleveland has seen a higher percentage of targets go to the slot than Pittsburgh has this year. Boyd is ranked too low at wide receiver 28 this week. John Brown's coming off a game where he saw 29% of the team's targets, he had almost 100 yards, and now he gets an above-average matchup in a game with one of the highest over-unders on the week. In other words, he's a good play this week, and I think he's ranked way too low over on Fantasy Pros. That's it. And so is Jalen Reagor. The last time we saw this Eagles team, Reagor wasn't unbelievable from a production standpoint. I get it. But he did find the end zone, and he did have a target share over 23%. Now he gets a Giants team that's been an above-average matchup in terms of adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, and cornerback James Bradbury is probably going to see Travis Fulgham this week. So I think he's a solid enough wide receiver 3, but he's being ranked as a wide receiver 5. Give me all the Jalen Reagor. Josh Reynolds has averaged a 16.2% target share per game over his last 6 contests. And over his last 2, that number's 21%. Seattle's been horrific against wide receivers this season. They're allowing over 20 more points per game to team wide receivers versus those team season-long averages. Considering that, I think Reynolds works as a deeper sleeper this week. Now, on the other side of things, I don't like wide receivers this week with the first name DJ. I generally hate people who go by initials for their first name. DJ Chark is coming off a huge game where he saw a monster target share, but he gets the Packers this week, which means he'll probably face off against Jair Alexander. Among relevant corners, Alexander has allowed the 3rd fewest yards per snap this season. He's tied with Jalen Ramsey. That's all according to PFF. You'll have to monitor Alexander's status because he did have a concussion in their last game, but if he plays, Chark gets a downgrade. And while you might not be able to bench Chark, I think there are reasons that you could possibly bench DJ Moore this week. The emergence of Curtis Samuel has hurt Moore. Samuel has had a target share of almost 21% over his last 3 games. That number was 7 percentage points lower during his 5 games prior. With DJ Moore, his target share per game was 24.2% to start the year. That's dropped by over 8% over his last 3. The 3 where Samuel's seen an uptick. I don't absolutely love the matchup for the Carolina passing attack this week either, which is what I talked about earlier with Teddy Bridgewater. That means that Moore is a bit of a risk. I talked about Austin Hooper on the 15 Transaction Show, and I like him this week in that game against Houston. He was averaging about a 20% target share per game before getting appendicitis, and now there's no OBJ in that Browns lineup. I think we could see a nice little uptick in volume for Hooper. So not only is his rest of season schedule looking good, I think he's a low-end tight end 1 this week against Houston, and Houston's an above-average matchup. So there's probably no Jack Doyle this week for Indianapolis because of a concussion, and that means that we're going to see Trey Burton and my guy Mo Alley-Cox get featured a little bit more for the Colts. Burton is the safer streaming option, but I think Alley-Cox brings more upside. Mack ended up running 16 routes to Burton's 23 last week when Doyle went down, but he's just so freaking efficient. He leads all tight ends across the league in yards per route run right now. And even last week, he caught 3 of 3 targets for 43 yards. I think Mo Alley-Cox is a great deeper play this week, but Burton is probably the safer option. Now, just to reiterate what I said on the 15 Transaction Show, Minnesota is in play as a defensive streamer this week. Chicago has allowed 3 straight top 8 performances to opposing defenses. They've been average in sack rate allowed. The game has a low over-under. The Vikings are favorites. They fit the process for a defensive streamer. And so does Philadelphia. Each week I overlay pressure rate versus pressure rate allowed to help find intriguing matchups. The Steelers almost always have a huge advantage because of how well their defense plays. But the second best advantage this week is for the Eagles over the Giants. The Giants have been pretty bad at protecting Daniel Jones, and the Eagles are 6th in the NFL in pressure rate. We know Daniel Jones is turnover friendly, and I think that we could see some of that come out against the Eagles off of their bye. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly Mailbag Show.